The air froze. Cameras locked. Brett Kavanaugh's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence was thunderous, pulsing beneath the harsh glare of studio lights. In the center of the stage, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood calm and deliberate, a single sheet of paper trembling ever so slightly between her fingers. It wasn't fear, it was focus, precision, purpose. Across from her, Kavanaugh's polished composure began to crack. A bead of sweat cut through the stillness, tracing the line of a man who'd built his legacy on secrecy. The moderator's voice faltered, unsure whether to intervene or just let history happen live on national television. Then came her voice low, steady, slicing through the tension. "This memo," she said, lifting the document, "wasn't supposed to reach the public. But here we are." The audience held its breath. Somewhere backstage, producers gestured wildly, desperate to cut to commercial. But it was too late in 20 seconds. One congresswoman had turned a Supreme Court myth into a national crisis because power blinked. Truth stood tall, and what that memo contained was never meant to see the light of television. That morning began like any other in Washington, headlines soft, chatter predictable, and cameras prepped for what producers called a routine hearing. No fireworks, no scandals. Just another polite conversation meant to fill the afternoon news cycle. But beneath that surface calm, something restless stirred. Staffers exchanged whispers in the hallways, avoiding direct eye contact. One memo rumored, denied and buried, had resurfaced, and the name attached to it carried the weight of the Supreme Court itself. Brett Kavanaugh, a man whose every confirmation word had been measured, filtered, and rehearsed, was about to face something no briefing could prepare him for, an unfiltered truth in the control rooms. Producers leaned forward. The smell of scandal, that electric scent of ambition and downfall, hung in the air. Viewers at home had no idea that the script they expected was about to burn, because this wasn't just about one memo. It was about trust, the fragile thread connecting the people to their highest court. For years, Americans had been told to believe in blind justice. But what if the blindfold had slipped? What if the nation's referee had been quietly favoring one side all along? Jasmine Crockett knew what was at stake. Integrity versus influence, conscience versus career. And she was willing to risk both. Everyone thought they were watching another forgettable interview, until Jasmine Crockett asked one question. Brett Kavanaugh's story was built like marble, polished, permanent, untouchable. From Georgetown prep to Yale Law, he'd traveled the golden escalator of American privilege, and one glowing recommendation at a time. Professors praised his intellect, politicians vouched for his temperament, and mentors whispered his name in the corridors of power long before the public ever knew it. His rise wasn't accidental. It was engineered by the time he reached the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh had perfected the image, a man of composure, a servant of the Constitution, a judge who never cracked. Cameras loved that calm. Commentators called it judicial poise. But beneath that marble surface, something less elegant had always stirred the faint hum of entitlement. The quiet insistence that rules bent for those who'd written them. He'd faced hearings before, scandals that threatened to pull him under, accusations dismissed, tempers masked behind carefully chosen words, and each time he survived. Not because truth cleared him, but because power protected him. His composure wasn't confidence. It was armor forged from the belief that consequences were for other people. Over the years, small fissures began to show. Leaked emails, partisan speeches, private dinners that blurred the sacred line between justice and politics. Yet still, the myth endured. To the cameras, he remained the impenetrable judge, unmoved, unbreakable, untouchable. But power corrodes quietly. It doesn't announce itself with thunder. It seeps in through comfort, familiarity, and unchecked loyalty. That's what the memo threatened to expose. Not a single act, but a pattern. Whispers suggested it held correspondence between chambers and political allies, notes hinting at bias. Coordination, or worse, betrayal of judicial neutrality. He'd faced hearings, scandals, and storms, but none like this. Because this time the challenge wasn't behind closed doors or filtered through legal jargon. This time, the confrontation was live, raw, and inescapable. As the lights bore down on him that evening, his practiced calm began to falter. The faint twitch in his jaw, the tightening grip on the desk, tells that no amount of courtroom decorum could hide. He thought he'd buried it deep enough. But Crockett had just dug it up live. Jasmine Crockett didn't inherit power. She earned it one fight. One courtroom, one sleepless night at a time. Before the cameras, before Congress, she was the attorney who stood beside the people the system forgot. Mothers evicted for speaking up. Workers silenced for asking questions. Protesters charged for demanding justice. Every case left a scar and a lesson. The law could be both a shield and a weapon, depending on who held it. Her rise wasn't scripted in privilege. It was carved out of defiance. When other lawyers folded under pressure, she leaned in, her voice steady, her words surgical. Judges learned to brace themselves when Crockett stood, because she carried not just arguments, but lived experience in the corridors of Congress. She saw the same disease she'd battled in courtrooms: hypocrisy dressed in procedure, power guarding itself under the flag of decorum. The higher she climbed, the more she saw how truth was negotiated, softened, and buried. And every buried truth came with a cost someone else had to pay. There was one night, years before the cameras found her, when a mentor, an older civil rights attorney with tired eyes, told her, "They'll try to make you choose between being respected and being right. Never give them that choice." Those words stayed etched like scripture. When the Supreme Court memo crossed her desk, it wasn't shock that filled her, it was recognition. She'd seen this pattern before. A powerful man protected by silence. A truth smothered for the sake of stability. But this time, she had the platform. The question wasn't whether she could speak, it was whether she would. The morning of the show, she sat alone in her office, the documents spread before her like a loaded weapon. Outside, aides moved briskly, phones rang, the city hummed. But inside that room, there was stillness. She read every line twice, steadying her breath, tracing the sentences that hinted at collusion and compromise. Her fingers paused over one paragraph, the kind of revelation that could fracture public trust overnight. No grand gestures, no rehearsed lines. Just a quiet resolve that this time, the truth would not die in committee. When she finally looked up, the weight of history sat quietly on her shoulders. She wasn't coming to win an argument. She came to end a lie. The studio gleamed under 1,000 watts of light, sterile, pristine, and merciless. Every breath, every blink was magnified. Viewers across the nation leaned closer to their screens as Brett Kavanaugh adjusted his tie. The emblem of composure and control. He began with the tone of a man accustomed to deference, calm, confident, dismissive. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, these insinuations are simply political theater," he said. His words polished, his smile rehearsed. The hosts nodded nervously, eager to move on, to keep the conversation safe. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, eyes unblinking, her silence louder than his monologue. Each sentence he uttered was another brick in a wall he didn't realize he was building around himself. The camera cut between them, the judge cloaked in authority, Congresswoman radiating calm defiance. A hush swept over the set. You could feel the tension and the static of the microphones in the way one of the producers mouthed "cut to commercial," but didn't dare press the button. Kavanaugh's voice wavered for half a second, a hint of uncertainty seeping through his confidence. Crockett leaned forward, not aggressively, just deliberately. Her tone was measured, her words precise. "Judge," she said, pausing just long enough for every viewer to hold their breath. "Before you continue, could you clarify this memo?" Silence. For a fraction of a second, the entire set froze. Kavanaugh's hand shifted on the desk, a tremor of control slipping through his fingers. The studio audience murmured. One of the hosts blinked twice, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. He glanced down, as if searching for a script that no longer applied. The rhythm he'd controlled just seconds ago was gone, replaced by an invisible weight pressing down on the room. And that's when the first crack appeared. Time slowed. The air thickened. Every camera, every lens, every heartbeat in the studio fixed itself on Jasmine Crockett as she reached for the document. The same one that had lived in sealed folders, behind closed doors, and beneath years of polished denial. Her fingers didn't tremble. They moved with purpose. A calm, deliberate motion that told everyone watching. This was not a stunt. This was judgment. Congresswoman Kavanaugh began, his tone defensive, seeking refuge in authority. But she didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her silence did the talking. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, the kind that doesn't need volume to command a room. "This memo," she said, unfolding the pages so that the camera caught the Supreme Court seal glinting under the lights, was circulated during a private session regarding pending cases before any public hearing was held. A hush fell. She read aloud. One line at a time, not as accusation, but as revelation. We should ensure alignment with sympathetic officials before announcement. Optics will matter more than precedent. Coordination with external voices will stabilize the narrative. Each phrase landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. The audience didn't breathe. Kavanaugh's eyes darted between the host and the camera. Then back to Crockett, searching for a lifeline that wasn't coming. That language, she continued, doesn't read like impartial justice, Judge. It reads like strategy. Like politics in robes. He shifted in his seat, the confident posture melting into something brittle. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Congresswoman, but I'm not implying anything," she said evenly, sliding the paper toward him. "I'm reading your words." The producers behind the glass were whispering, gesturing wildly. One mouthed, "Cut to break." Another shook their head. It was too late. The story was live, and the country was already watching. On split screens across America, social media exploded. Hashtags bloomed mid-sentence, memo leak, justice for sale, Crockett vs. Kavanaugh. Within seconds, the clip was being clipped, shared, dissected. Commentators would later call it the moment the courtroom met the court of public opinion. But inside the studio, time stayed frozen. Kavanaugh's hand moved toward the microphone, then stopped. A dry swallow caught in his throat. His voice, once unshakable, came out thin. "These excerpts are being taken out of context." Crockett leaned forward, calm as a still lake. "Context, Judge, is everything, and the American people deserve all of it." The audience murmured again, a low, rising hum like the prelude to thunder. He tried to smile, but it faltered halfway, replaced by the distant look of a man realizing that control was no longer his. The narrator's voice slipped in, low and cinematic, for a man built on control. Silence was the loudest confession. And Kavanaugh's silence was deafening. His eyes flicked to the moderator, a silent plea for rescue. None came. The lights were unflinching. The truth, even more so. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She simply folded the memo again, her gestures slow, deliberate. Almost reverent, as though she were handling not paper, but evidence of something sacred betrayed. Then she looked directly into the camera. "Justice can't be selective." "Judge," she said, her voice firm but not angry. The voice of someone reclaiming the moral ground. "Either it's blind or it's broken." Silence followed. No applause. No interruptions. Just the quiet, its electric stillness of a nation realizing it had just witnessed something irreversible. The cameras lingered on Kavanaugh's face, eyes unfocused, lips parted but wordless. The once immovable judge now looked small beneath. The lights that once glorified him. And as the network feed cut to a stunned anchor desk, the narrator whispered, and in that silence, America heard everything. The silence didn't last long. Within minutes of the broadcast, the world erupted. Screens lit up, phones buzzed, notifications poured in like digital thunder. Hashtags ignited memo leak, justice for sale, Crockett vs. Kavanaugh, each spreading like wildfire across timelines. What had begun as a quiet studio exchange was now the loudest conversation in the country. Clips flooded every platform, the slow zoom on Kavanaugh's face, the calm certainty in Crockett's tone, the paper unfolding like a verdict. Millions watched, replayed, and shared it with captions that cut deeper than commentary. She said, "What we've all been waiting to hear." Cable networks scrambled to catch up. Commentators stumbled through breaking coverage, some calling it a courageous reckoning, others framing it as a dangerous attack on judicial independence. On late-night shows, comedians turned the memo into punchlines, but even their laughter carried unease. The line between justice and performance had never felt thinner. Outside courthouses, crowds began to gather, not organized, not planned, just drawn by a shared instinct that something historic had cracked open. Homemade signs appeared in the glow of phone cameras. Blind justice, not bought justice. Truth needs no permission. Porters shouted questions to senators emerging from meetings. Most dodged, others looked shaken. Journalists traced the memo's trail, confirming its authenticity piece by piece. Newspapers that once treated supreme court ethics as untouchable were suddenly front-paging the unthinkable. Evidence suggests political coordination within judicial circles. The marble veneer was chipping, and everyone could see the dust. In Congress, allies rallied around Crockett. Some called her reckless. Others called her brave. But across living rooms, classrooms, and late-shift diners, people called her real. She wasn't another politician reading talking points. She was the mirror, reflecting a country's quiet anger. The emotional current was undeniable. For years, faith in institutions had eroded grain by grain, yet in one night, single question on live TV reignited the belief that truth could still break through. Parents showed their kids the clip. Teachers played it in civics class. Activists wove it into their chants. The narrator's tone deepened. In one night, a question became a movement, and a movement became a demand. Crockett hadn't planned to start a fire, but fires don't ask permission. Somewhere, deep within the marble halls of the Supreme Court, lights stayed on late. Staff whispered behind closed doors, shredders hummed, and calls were made to people whose names rarely surfaced in public. Because behind those marble walls, phones were already ringing. Days later, the storm hadn't settled. It had reshaped the sky. The memo was authenticated, the denials collapsed, and the nation stood staring at the truth it had long suspected but rarely seen, exposed so clearly. Headlines read like eulogies for trust. Commentators spoke in cautious tones. But for Jasmine Crockett, the noise didn't matter. In the quiet of her office, away from the cameras and the endless scroll of reactions, she sat with the weight of it all. Exhausted, yes, but resolute. The victory wasn't clean or celebratory. It was heavy, earned, and real. On her desk, the same document that had lit a national fire now lay folded. Its power spent, but its purpose fulfilled. The narrator's voice softened. Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to be ignored. Crockett thought of every moment that had led here, the years of watching institutions protect their own, the hearings that turned justice into theater, the times she'd been told to wait, to temper, to be patient, and now the waiting was over. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't grandstanded. She had simply stood her ground. That was the difference, because courage isn't about confrontation, it's about consistency. It's showing up even when silence would be safer. It's holding the line even when the world moves to erase it. The cameras had gone dark, but the impact lingered in conversations over dinner tables. In classrooms, where young voices began to ask harder questions, in the quiet resolve of people realizing that justice only breathes when someone dares to keep it alive. The narrator's tone lifted, almost reverent. Arrogance fades. Integrity endures. Outside, night had fallen over the Capitol. Crockett rose, gathered her notes, and walked toward the exit. The studio lights behind her dimmed one by one, their glow fading into silence, and as she stepped into the cool air beyond the doors, her voice echoed softly not to an audience, but to herself, because power borrowed from silence will always fall to truth spoken in daylight. That night, Brett Kavanaugh panicked, but America woke up. What began as a routine interview became a reckoning. A reminder that even the most guarded institutions can't outrun daylight forever. The narrator's voice returns, steady and reflective. Moments like these remind us democracy isn't protected by silence, but by those who speak across the nation. People are still talking, still questioning, still choosing courage over comfort, and that's how change begins. Not with applause, but with awareness. Not with permission, but with persistence. So if you believe truth still matters, share this story. Keep it alive. Because the next revelation, the next crack in the armor of arrogance, might depend on you, on your voice, your courage, your refusal to look away. The camera drifts over the now empty studio, the faint hum of electronics fading into stillness. On the desk, the memo lies quietly, no longer a secret, but a symbol. As the lights dim and the screen fades to black, the narrator whispers one final truth, because real justice doesn't hide behind curtains, it walks out under the lights.